The average medical record is more than half the length of Hamlet, which is Shakespeare's longest play. I think we need these tools to help us make sense of all of the available information and process it and package it in ways that we can digest it and then take better action.
Hello, and welcome to AI in Healthcare. My name is Mika Newton, and I'm your host. I'm here with Dr. Spencer Dorn. Spencer, great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mika. Pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful. So let's get right into it. One of the things that I've been tracking and following is AI Scribes and all the different companies in the AI scribing space. And it's interesting to me because it appears like there's quite a competition heating up. So maybe we could start with what exactly are these AI scribes and what are their limitations? Are certain ones better than others? How do you view that entire market segment?
Yeah, well, AI scribes are probably the leading clinician-facing AI right now in the current day. And I think it's interesting the reasons to think of why scribes have jumped out so quickly. One is it's not that quick. Actually, people have been working on this technology for several years, and some of the, as the voice or the speech recording has been around for a while, and then the ability to transcribe a conversation and turn that into a note. So the technology's been ripe for a while. The content of a medical conversation actually is not that long compared to other data streams we deal with. And then there's obviously it's a clear pain point. Clinicians spend a lot of time writing their notes, often, staying late in clinic or doing their notes after eating dinner with their families. So I think it was just an easy convergence of the tech being ripe and the pain point being obvious. And we had human scribes, which were kind of it was easy to envision what a automated scribe would look like. So there are many, many scribe solutions in the market, as you alluded to, dozens, at least 50 or 60. Some people would say at least 100. And they all exist in varying different capacities. And I think really what differentiates them is their ability to integrate with the EHR. So it's pretty easy to build a standalone scribe, like a simple web app that transcribes or records and then transcribes and creates a note of a conversation, and then physician can copy and paste that over from into his or her notes. But that's pretty limited, right? That's pretty limited in itself. And one thing that's interesting about scribes that most people don't realize is only about a third of clinical notes are informed by conversations, like the conversation you and I are having now. Most of clinical notes either summarize other information in the record intentionally or passively by links. And then part of the note is based on the assessment and plan, which scribes, some of them can do, but they're not as great. So scribes are really useful for what we would call the HPI, the history of present illness, right? The conversation that you have with a patient. Not as great for the assessment and plan and for summarizing other portions of the notes. So scribe companies that are standalone, they could do that first portion pretty well, but there's a limit to how much more they can do within the note. And there's certainly a limit in terms of how much deeper they can go into the workflow beyond the note, because note writing is just one of many activities clinicians do when taking care of patients.
So are these scribes actually contextually aware? Is that kind of what you're alluding at? Or are they just aware of what's happening in that moment in that conversation? Are you saying that they're looking at what else is going on, let's say in the patient's history, perhaps in other parts of the medical record, and then they're using that to actually inform what they're scribing or writing in the note?
So it depends. So some of the, I don't want to say rudimentary because that sounds like a negative, but some of the more basic non-integrated scribes are focused purely on the conversation a patient and a doctor are having. And you can go far with that, but there's only so far you can go. Scribes that integrate more deeply into the electronic health records have more contextual awareness, as you mentioned, and some of the leading products now are starting to summarize some of the background and the history. Some of the leading products that are integrated are listening to the conversation and staging or pending potential orders or picking up diagnoses and putting those into a queue for clinicians to verify. And some scribes are even moving towards the point of clinical decision support. So we're having this conversation. It knows a bit about you as a patient. We discuss something. Maybe there's some medical knowledge outside somewhere that should be brought into my decision making or our joint decision making. So varying degrees of functionality that at the core really depends not only on the technology of the vendor, but also the degree of integration with the EHR, which is, in my mind, really what differentiates these different products.
Yeah, interesting. One thing that was brought to my attention was the fact that some of what's actually written in these notes and the codes themselves end up affecting things like downstream reimbursement, right?
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things that I heard noted is that often the clinician's notes don't necessarily match the language or nomenclature required for reimbursement. And there's been some efforts, and I don't know this, I've just heard it third party, some efforts to help the scribes essentially write the notes in a way that would have almost like a healthcare operations downstream effect. Is that a true thing? Is that an actual thing that's ongoing or
Yes, it's certainly a true thing. So one of the challenges with adopting any technology is assessing the return on investment of the technology. And there are many domains that you can assess return on investment, right? There's the patient experience is a domain where maybe suddenly patients are happy that their physicians are looking up from their keyboards and making eye contact for the first time in years. So maybe patient experience improves as a result of a technology like a Scribe, or maybe there's a physician well-being aspect that I'm happy now that I don't have to go home and write all my notes after dinner because most of it I'm getting done in the office. Or maybe there's an efficiency perspective. Am I able to get through my day faster? But often what's anchored upon is there a financial return on investment? We're spending X amount of dollars on this technology product, in this case, Scribes. Are we getting some of that money back? Are we getting a positive return on our investment? And many healthcare AI companies, not just in the Scribe space, anchor around revenue and reimbursement and coding. And whether it's more so in the inpatient world than in the outpatient world, that there is an opportunity to surface potential diagnostic codes that may lead to more accurate risk coding, so that when you look at things like HEC RAF scores, or on the inpatient world, what's known as CCs and MCCs. So these are risk adjustment for DRGs. It may give increased weighting to more accurately reflect what the patient's actually experiencing. So I think that's what you're getting at, Mika.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, I mean, is that recognized, right? Because I think you made a great point here in my discussions with providers and provider systems. There's efficiency and patient safety and patient experience. And then there's like, how do we make money and stay in business as a healthcare provider, which is a very important concern, right? And if we're investing in new technology, particularly in the AI space, I think that many people are often not well informed as to what the actual buying decisions are. Like, how do you view spending extra dollars on software license, right, versus necessarily just increasing safety or patient experience? Because many provider systems, frankly, just aren't making a ton of money to start with. And this new technology is very promising, but we've got to figure out how to pay for it. So is there a clear justification then? Like, you could say, yes, this type of scribing technology has a definite application implication. And that's one of the reasons, to your point, not only is it kind of the perfect technology combination, but there's a financial ROI that's pretty easy to understand as well.
Yeah, for Scribes, it's not as obvious as it is for some inpatient tools. On the inpatient world, I think physicians routinely undercode the complexity of the patients they're seeing. For instance, I'm a gastroenterologist. A lot of the inpatients I see are malnourished, right? They have digestive challenges. They may not be eating enough. I often don't think to code the patient is malnourished. I think, well, the code is Crohn's disease of the small bowel. So there are these little, or another common one would be we often patients we care for have fluid and electrolyte disorders, but we're just used to seeing that, so we don't necessarily think to add that as a diagnosis. There are many inpatient tools, not scribes per se, that will surface some of those codes and remind clinicians, oh, you may want to add this. And that has a more direct link towards risk scoring and hospital reimbursement. On the outpatient world, it's not as obvious. I think there are some opportunities to surface some of these diagnoses that play into some of the more value-based care coding considerations. There's also something called the level of service. So depending on the amount of effort you put into a visit, in the fee-for-service world, you can kind of code it or charge different amounts, enter different charges. So there's some potential runway there for these AI scribes. And companies are seriously motivated to move in that direction. So I think I'm giving you a partial answer. Yes, I think there's some potential on the financial ROI piece, but on the outpatient world, it's not as obvious as some of the inpatient tools that we use. I think in general, scribes are more of a physician wellness and well-being and somewhat efficiency tool. Although if you look at the data, the scribes, at least so far, do not seem to be saving that much time. But the physicians who use them tend to really like using them. So I think that in itself has a lot of validation for the product category.
So I have maybe a different line of questioning here around scribes, and it's about the other entities. So do these scribes work well when there's like more than two people? Like, let's say there's patients with family members in the room, and the family members and the patient may be saying different things, right? And there may be different elements. I'm kind of thinking of the conversation. So that's piece one. Let's talk about that piece. And then I have another different entity question I'll ask after that.
Yeah, so I haven't personally used it with two patients in the room or two people in the room at once. Obviously, a lot of the patients we care for bring family members, their spouse, their parents, their children, etc. The secret is I actually don't use scribes very much. I can tell you why, but I played with them plenty, but I haven't used them in that situation. Many of the companies, though, do report high accuracy, even when there are multiple parties involved. And then the other thing with language, the beauty of these tools is, right, they're language machines. So let's say there's a Spanish-speaking doctor and a Spanish-speaking patient. Scribes can... most scribes that I'm familiar with can actually handle that situation quite well.
Quite well. Yeah. The translation capabilities, frankly, from playing around with LLMs in general.
Exactly. That's what these tools are really good at.
Yeah. Okay. So another entity question, and we can move on from scribes here. But if some of the scribes are summarizing the data that's already in the medical record, and other scribing tools are writing, right, and adapting the data that's going into the medical record, are we getting into a world where the AI is summarizing what the other AI said and then re-summarizing it? It feels like there might be a lot of AI talking to each other in here at some point.
You're right. And I think that's a concern that many people have. Will medical records be overpopulated with bot shit, right? Is that just like, spitting out, and regurgitating stuff that another bot wrote? I think the argument against that is that the medical record's already polluted with a lot of junk and nonsense.
Yes.
And it takes a lot of effort to identify the meaningful nuggets of information you need. So on the one hand, you can argue we need AI because there's no other way to make sense of the tidal wave of information, a lot of it, nonsensical or unnecessary or duplicative to begin with. But yes, I think you're concerned, Mika, about polluting the medical record with kind of AI generated content that's just kind of recycled and repackaged continually again and again. It could, at least theoretically, degrade the quality of information within the records.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it happens whether it's humans or AI, right? I mean, a lot of times when you look at medical records, you see the progress note, which is a cut and paste of the last progress note plus two sentences, which are then cut and paste. And then somebody gets sick of cut and pasting somewhere along the history and starts a new, like there's just random stuff.
Exactly. Or you'll see like someone will say a 36-year-old man, and the man is 63, but it's just every note it says 36-year-old man, 36-year-old man. So they're, we propagate these errors. With all I think it's always important to first recognize that as human clinicians, healthcare workers, we're far from perfect. So the base case, we shouldn't assume perfection because that's never true. Now, we should hold these tools to a high standard, and we should hold ourselves to a high standard. At the same time, let's be realistic.
Totally agree. So what tasks here, picking a different question here. So what tasks do you think beyond scribing is AI going to be really good at helping doctors with? Like where are the opportunities for bringing technology and AI in? And in particular, I think about this in the context of what I view as kind of the central problem we have, which is not enough hospitals, not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough staff, too many sick people, and it's too expensive. Like it seems to me technology is the only solution I've been able to think of. I wish there was a different one. But where is it actually going to move the needle and make a difference?
Yeah, I guess I'll give you one kind of short-term tangible, and then we can talk just more generally. The shorter term is, I think, summarization. I think summarizing clinical information, both about individual patients, but also the medical literature and knowledge. I think that is vastly under discussed. I think it's extremely possible to apply even today's tools to either patient records or the medical literature to summarize, synthesize, and contextualize information that's meaningful at the point of care. So I think that is really the next wave of tools we'll see. Kind of phase one has been this proliferation of AI scribes and widespread adoption, and now we're starting to see the signals that, yeah, these seem to help. They certainly don't fix all of our problems. Only about a third of doctors use these tools. The doctors who use them seem to like them a lot. It doesn't really save them that much time, but reduces their cognitive load and their reported burnout. So great. So let's keep investing in these and spreading them, as we discussed earlier, to other aspects of the workflow. But I'm really bullish on using AI to summarize information because, this is from Zach Kohaney, speaks about this axiom. At its core, medicine is an information processing discipline. And I'd go farther. I'd say even not beyond medicine, healthcare is an information processing discipline, right? We're constantly looking to collect the right pieces of information, synthesize it into a coherent, logical story or argument, supplement that with other information we need so we can make ideal decisions. And the fact of the matter is that there's just too much information for us to do that with on a regular basis in a reasonable time frame. The average medical record is more than half the length of Hamlet, which is Shakespeare's longest play. You could read all these analogies that people make to great works of literature. But it's just impossible to go through that information fast enough. The medical literature it depends on the estimate you're looking at. There's one study that states it's doubling every 73 days, which I find a little hard to believe, but a more conservative estimate would be the medical literature doubles on average every 5 years or so. So it's within 5 years of graduating medical school, half of what you've learned is outdated. I mean, so I think we need these tools to help us make sense of all of the available information and process it and package it in ways that we can digest it and then take better action. So I think summarization, I think really is the current focus, the current frontier, both for clinical summarization as well as medical literature summarization. And then longer term, which I alluded to, I think the real holy grail, or one of the holy grails, is how do we make better decisions, right? I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to, is how do we use these tools to make better decisions? And part of it is maybe if we're less burdened from writing notes, for those doctors who like to use scribes, they have more time to think, right? So that's one stream of possibilities, is for less burdened with kind of mundane, time-consuming tasks that we don't necessarily need to do. Maybe we can think more. Another is if we can synthesize and summarize information and make it available at the point of care, we'll make better decisions. Another is using predictive algorithms to try and forecast what may happen, so that we can work with people to better understand the risk and help apply judgment so we can make the best decisions to mitigate those risks. So I think long term, can we make better decisions is ultimately the opportunity here with
Yeah.
AI. And of course, the work that you and others are doing, right? Can we make new discoveries? Can we become more of a learning system? And how do we apply these tools for discovery? That would be an additional stream of possibility.
Spencer, there's you just touched on like a bunch of like my absolutely most favorite topics. Number one, I think summarization has, kind of a couple of elements to me. I always think about kind of two concepts. I think about information retrieval, right? And when I think about retrieval, it kind of brings me back to information gain, right? Which is the difference between coded and uncoded data, and how certain are you? What's the accuracy if you've taken something that's, let's say, unstructured, or an image that's been processed or something like that and turned it into structured data? And then the retrieval question is actually like this really complex filtering question. And I almost feel like it should play a part in summarization, because to your point, like lots of people are talking about summarization. And when someone says, well, give me a summary, I always think of like, well, what do you want the summary for? Right? Like, because there's different summaries of things, because it's a subset of the data, right? By definition, almost. Yep. So do you see anyone making good strides in kind of context specific summarization? Is it that each context, certain situations are going to have good summaries and we move to different situations? Is anyone, do you think, really doing a good job in that space of thinking through those issues?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think without naming specific names, yes. Summaries are only useful for you in the specific work you're doing in the specific context. So an analogy I give is, so tomorrow I'm in clinic, and before we got on this call, I was preparing for clinic by reading through my new patients' records. And they've all seen multiple gastroenterologists, because I'm often like, the guy who sees people who have challenging problems that can't necessarily be fixed easily. And so much of what I'm doing is reading through these records, often PDFs that are uploaded to the electronic health record. And there's a lot of information there I'm just simply not interested in. I'm not necessarily interested in their knee repair, their ACL repair from several years ago, or that they had an allergic reaction to some medication I'm never going to prescribe. Or, I mean, of course I'm interested on some level, but I don't know, I need to concentrate on the things that are most relevant for the problems that I'm seeing them for. So we need to contextualize summaries. A summary that may be great for a cardiologist may not work so well, usually won't work so well for a gastroenterologist or an orthopedist, etc. And then even within a given discipline or domain, we all have different styles. And well, one, we have different practices, right? I'm a gastroenterologist who focuses on working with people, with adults with certain types of difficult to manage GI symptoms and motility disorders. So what I'm interested in may be different than my colleague who's an inflammatory bowel disease expert. So that's one. But even if we're all interested in the same thing and we're all focused on the same types of serving the same types of people, we have different styles. We may have different things that we pay attention to. So I think personalization of these tools is super important. The one size fits all tool, helpful to some extent, but just like any tool, we'll fall flat in certain instances. So I think we need more adaptive tools that meet our needs, just like in consumer technology, right? I mean, your iPhone, you could choose the apps that you like most,
Mhm.
And an app, the weather app you love may be really different than the weather app I love. And it turns out, well, maybe you're a mountain climber and you need something that's really specific at high. It's obviously a silly example, but I think the same exists in healthcare, and that we need summaries that are context specific and respect or align with the preferences of the end user.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up the iPhone. I got to think I have several hundred apps and I only use 3 of them or something like that.
Right. Me too.
Um, you talked a little bit about clinical decision support, and that's also kind of a topic that hits home. I think and I spent a fair amount of time actually in health economics research and policy research around guidelines. And a lot of that was focused on meta-analysis and analysis of the literature for guidelines. It feels to me like there's an exciting opportunity and your point, right? The medical literature is just growing so rapidly. How could anyone possibly keep up to date with it? How do you allow AI to point and summarize that type of information in a way that's actually safe? Because some of it's really good and some of it's really bad. Even, people talk about peer-reviewed published stuff. I always think about all the things that have, been found out to be erroneous later or have been removed from the literature. And how do you know what you know? And how do you summarize it? Because if you bring patient data and information retrieval and summarization together with the best in evidence-based medicine, which should technically be in the peer-reviewed gold standard, right, of clinical trials and reviews and meta-analyses, tying those two things together would seem like a grail, but no one's really figured that out, how to do it well. Is that coming?
I hope so. I think there are many focused on the summarization of clinical information, and there are some focused on the summarization of, medical literature, not medical knowledge, whatever you want to term it. Ultimately, it's logical, as you mentioned, for these to converge. But I think there are different groups of experts and different types of companies working on the two. I'd say from the medical literature perspective, although apparently medical knowledge doubles every 73 days on probably the overly aggressive timeline, or 5 years. Most of those studies are probably not worth reading, right? Like, it's not that hard to publish a study. You could find there's a journal for everything. And just because something's published in a peer-reviewed journal article doesn't mean it's worthy of incorporating into practice. So I think the better companies are focused on ranking. So it's more of you ask a question, it becomes more of a search problem, right? And a retrieval problem than a synthesizing the response. So how do you index the medical literature and weight it in a way so that, if someone asks a question, how are you surfacing the relevant studies for that question, the highest quality studies for that question, and then packaging, that information into a cogent, coherent summary that includes enough details without being too much. So I think that's one end. On the clinical side, as we mentioned, there's a lot of junk in electronic health records, right? The 36-year-old man who's really 63, or some medical problem that patients I never heard of that. How'd that get added? So, in many ways, the risk for clinical summarization there is the garbage in, garbage out problem, which really is not an excuse, right? If you create a great summary of a bunch of junk, well, it's still kind of junk. So I think the better companies here and the better approaches are mapping concepts in a way that allow them to figure out, well, is this accurate, or is there a high degree that this is inaccurate, this attribute in the record, or this artifact, I should say, in the record. So therefore, we probably shouldn't include it in the summary. So I think there's opportunities on both ends to kind of sift through noise and avoid some of the garbage that plagues both the medical literature and the patient records. And I think it takes, I think, a lot of ingenuity and hard work to deliver summaries that are based and grounded in truth and are useful. And then I think you're asking, how do they come together? Well, I think that's kind of the holy grail.
Well, you throw real world data in that too, and you've got the trifecta of things that we should have figured out. We've all been talking about for, I think, several decades now.
Well, that's the thing, right?
Maybe
Not everything's been published. So there are high quality publications, stuff that, if you're practicing in this area, you ideally should know this, or at least know how to access this information. And then there's real world evidence, right? Like no one's really published on this, but if you look at large groups of individuals at a given health system or even nationally with these characteristics, we can, learn from others. And then there's a whole, there's a lot of intuition and just gut instinct that we use based on experience that isn't necessarily encoded anywhere but in your own gut and your own brain. And, you learned it from someone years ago, or you learned it from, you saw a patient and you made this kind of conceptual connection. And definitely the first of the medical literature. I mean, that's set is, that's indexed, and there's a great company that's already doing that. And as you know, there are many companies working on the real world evidence part. I'm really interested in how do you encode kind of clinical gestalt, or what we've called, what some people call clinical pearls, and how do you democratize that? So, an old gray-haired physician who's been just an expert in their field, how do you share some of that wisdom with someone who's maybe newer, or someone not in that field but seeing a patient who could benefit from that wisdom? So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity here.
I always think of this idea of rationales. There's interventions, there's rationales, and rationales don't always need to be, clinicogenomic or anything along those lines. It might just seem like a good rationale is because every time I do that, it works out well.
Right.
And when I don't do that, it doesn't work out well. So there's a lot to that. Let's talk a little bit about what are the risks in AI. So, I don't think either of us would be here if we didn't believe in technology and that it's going to be a good thing. And people talk about the risks. Let's break that down into kind of two categories here. So what are the risks in using AI from like a patient clinical perspective? And then what are the risks on more of kind of a system basis? Like, what do we need to manage to make sure that we're actually able to take advantage of this new tech?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think the history of technology, not only in healthcare but everywhere, shows that with new technologies, we reap some benefits, and there's usually a bite back or an unintended consequence. And, there's some negative, there's a side effect. And there's certainly potential side effects of AI, just like we've seen with kind of the internet, modern digital technologies, electronic health records. Certainly, I think major net benefit, but there's certainly aspects of it that have not been beneficial. So, when it comes to AI, I think there are a host of potential risks. On one hand, there's kind of a lot of the technical risks we discuss, things like hallucinations, which are not just positive hallucinations, like making things up, but what about not surfacing things that should be surfaced? Like, I think a lot about that. That's an under-discussed area. There's, we talk about privacy concerns, and, just introducing errors and perpetuating biases from the data into practice, right? Just kind of encoding that. So I think those are the ones that I think initially come to mind for when we have these discussions. But I think about a lot of maybe more theoretical risks. But for instance, what's the risk that AI makes our jobs, our work harder, right? There's this assumption that AI will offload drudgery and kind of, let's give us superpowers so we could do more easier. We could function, we could perform higher with less effort or with equal effort. There's no guarantee though, Mika, about that. And if you look back at the history of technology, there have been many promises that technology would make lives easier. For instance, promises of a 30-hour work week that Keynes made in the 1930s. For instance, Betty Friedan, who wrote this groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, wrote in the 1960s how the average American housewife is actually spending more time working on her home than her grandmother did, despite things like washing machines and dryers and dishwashers. So I think we need to be careful and recognize the risk that while these tools are incredible and hopefully we will harness them for good and to make our patients' lives better and also healthcare workers' lives better, there is a real risk that these tools can make our work harder. So that's one thing that I think we don't talk enough about. Another risk I think we don't talk enough about is these tools are great for cognitive tasks, right? I mean, these tools are great for retrieving information, for summarizing information, for helping with clinical reasoning, all fantastic. But what happens to our critical thinking skills if we don't use them? What happens to if we're not writing notes anymore because we're all using scribes? And if writing a note, I believe, is part of the clinical reasoning process, not to over glamorize it or over romanticize it, but there is an element to writing a good note. If we're no longer writing notes that way, are we offloading our critical thinking? If we're no longer summarizing information ourselves and we're relying on the Cliff Notes version, maybe we're getting enough, but maybe we're not getting a fuller picture and really wrestling with the information in a way that makes us think. So I think that's a second one. And then a third one that I'm particularly concerned about is what does it do to our relationships? What medicine fundamentally is a relationship activity, right? We're in relationship with our patients. We're in relationship with our peers and other teammates. We're in relationship in many ways with ourselves and, what the activities of getting through the day. And how does AI modulate and affect those relationships? For instance, if you send me a message, Mika, and you want to hear back from me as your doctor, you don't want to hear back from a bot pretending to be me. I do worry that, we're all going to have our bots reading our messages and replying for, same emails, staff messages, not just patient messages. And so much of what we do is about signaling that we actually care enough to put the time in to do something. And if we take the easy route and just kind of offload things to machines, we may tarnish relationships. So long-winded answer, I think there's certainly the risks we all talk about, privacy, reliability, hallucinations, et cetera. But I think the risks we're not talking about is one, what if this makes our work paradoxically harder? Two, what about our critical thinking skills? And three, how do we protect our precious relationships with each other?
Fascinating. I love the last point about the relationships. That's actually, I think, something I hadn't really thought about in depth until you were just bringing it up. But the idea that at some point it's almost like an inherent, I don't know who I'm talking to anymore, and I can't discern what's real from not in that relationship. And then how invested am I? Like it's almost like if I don't know it's a real relationship, why do I care? Right? Why do I really want to put the time and energy in? I also love the concept of and I think you brought it up, I don't think enough people realize this fact too, that if you're missing information, right? Or if you have information, but you're not using it because you don't get it, like you're just not going deep enough. It's almost like this error of omission. Like you didn't read, like I gave you everything, but you didn't read it, or you chose somehow to ignore it, or something other agent chose to ignore it for you. Did that release you from the obligation to actually know it? And I think it ends up tying back to a question we're going to have to answer here eventually, I think, which is who's responsible? So underpinning all of this, right, is this kind of legal responsibility. Who's the practicing clinician? Who's got whose practice is actually, who's responsible for what's actually happening? And how do you have ownership over that? If you end up being responsible, you kind of have to own everything that sits underneath it and actually understand what those decisions are. And I just don't think I think we've talked about it from a lot of different angles, but I don't think anybody's come up with anything like a solution that I understand.
I think you're totally right. I think a lot about, what are the factors? Everyone expects AI just to spread, everyone's just going to download these tools and start using them. But the responsibility piece, especially in the absence of a clear regulatory framework, that's a big deal. Because at the end of the day, without clear regulations, who's ultimately responsible? Usually it's the clinician or the practice or the health system. And if these tools are imperfect, that's a big risk to be taking on. So I think the responsibility piece is a really big piece, and one that I'm not sure when we'll get some movement in one direction or another. But right now, these tools largely are in this kind of in between regulatory space where, I don't know, the FDA is supposed to regulate some of these, but the FDA doesn't necessarily have the authority to regulate everything and may not want to regulate many of these tools. And it's a really interesting time from that perspective. I think defining who, or to put it more simply, who's left holding the bag when there's a problem, that's a big deal.
And we figured that with insurance, right? Malpractice insurance. Like the clinician holds the bag, we buy insurance again. I mean, insurance is a good thing. It shares the risk of bad clinical practice among large groups of people, and it creates there's a financial incentive for someone to underwrite all of that risk, right? And aggregate it together. Like we've been doing risk management since, people started launching boats to sea to like go and discover new places.
Yeah.
And sharing the risks around that. But I don't think we've figured out the technology risk model yet of who really owns that risk when it's so diffuse across the parties. So wonderful. Spencer, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for coming on AI in Healthcare. I have enjoyed this immensely. I'm looking forward to keeping in touch and continuing these discussions going.
Yeah, it was really fun, Mika. Thanks so much.